Welcome to the 19th episode of my English Sovereigns podcast. In this episode, I shall be talking about the brief 2-year reign of King Harthacnut. Harthacnut, whose name in Danish means tough knot, was the last monarch from the House of Denmark, so that's the last time you'll hear this music. He had been planning to invade England and dislodge his half-brother and arguably the usurper, King Harald Harthacnut, from the throne, but Harald did him the convenience of dying before the invasion force could turn up, and therefore a lot of blood was saved and not spilled. Although, of course, Harald might have been murdered by forces loyal to Harthacnut. So the invasion force, he still came with it when Harald died, and the invasion force needed to be paid off, so he decided to levy a huge tax on the people of England, to the tune of about £21,000 in money back then, which translates to an extortionate sum. Now I don't know what, but it was going to be a lot. And actually, Harthacnut's policy on tax, we haven't really talked too much about tax as a theme in this, but obviously it will become a more relevant theme later as the tax base grows, of course. He had a very punitive tax system because obviously the crowns of Denmark and England had been reunited, and the North Sea Empire, which Cnut had established, needed to be maintained. So he taxed the citizens to the hilt in order to fund the navy and the military to keep his empire together. Harthacnut was very autocratic, especially in comparison to his brother. And as far as monarchs of this first period, from 802, from King Egbert to Harold Godwinson in 1066, Harthacnut was probably the most autocratic of them, because he'd been King of Denmark for 5 years first, and he was very much like, well, we need to reunite Denmark, because after Cnut's death, Denmark fractured, so he needed to be very much in control of the situation, which is understandable. But when he came to England, he sort of was met with a different culture, because the English culture that had emerged had been very much like, no, the English king can only govern through the Witan, which has been, again, quite a relevant theme too throughout this series. So he didn't like that. So when the Earl of Northumbria had the audacity to question him over his tax policy, Harthacnut was very angry and obviously didn't like it. He offered the Earl of Northumbria safe passage under the proviso that they were going to negotiate the tax rates or something, but ended up capturing the Earl of Northumbria and executing him. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as a result, called him an oathbreaker. So probably if he'd reigned for any longer, it might not have been, his reign might have met a sticky end. Although in itself, his reign did arguably meet a sticky end, because he died at a wedding in Lambeth through excessive drinking of alcohol, or arguably through his alcohol being poisoned and being spiked. Although if he drank too much alcohol, that in itself would have been poisoning. This was the inspiration for the death of King Joffrey Baratheon in Game of Thrones, who was famously poisoned by Olenna Tyrell. I hope that's not a spoiler. I mean, it's been out for 5 years. At his own wedding. And it wasn't Harthacnut's own wedding, but that is where the inspiration for George R.R. Martin's piece of literature came from. So that's something you might not have known. Harthacnut didn't leave any children, which is a shame, because if he'd had a son, he could have called it Quartercnut. I've always really liked that joke. It probably isn't very funny to anyone else, but I really like it. So therefore the throne went to his half-brother Edward the Confessor, who was Emma of Normandy's child through Ethelred. So yes, he was, as I said, the last monarch of the House of Denmark. He was good to the church as well. I mean, that is a theme that has been pretty consistent throughout this series too. So there we go. That was the reign of Harthacnut. So next time, in episode 20, we'll look at Edward the Confessor, who should be called Edward II, who was the last monarch from the House of Wessex. So thank you very much for listening, and see you then.